Chapter 1. Evolution and History. The end of the 19th century, a new interest in muscle building arose, not muscle just as a means of survival or of defending oneself. There was a return to the Greek ideal, muscular development as a celebration of the human body. This was the era when the ancient tradition of stone lifting evolved into the modern sport of weightlifting. As the sport developed, it took on different aspects in different cultures. In Europe, weightlifting was a form of entertainment from which professional strongmen emerged, men who made their living by how much weight they could lift or support. How their physiques looked didn't matter to them or to their audience. The result was that they tended to develop beefy, ponderous bodies. In America at this time, a considerable interest in strength in relation to its effect on health developed. The adherents of physical culture stressed the need for eating natural, unprocessed foods, an idea that took root in response to the increasing use of new food processing techniques. Americans were beginning to move from farms and small towns to the cities. The automobile provided a new mobility. But at the same time, life was becoming increasingly sedentary, and the health problems that arise when a population eats too much of the wrong food, doesn't get enough exercise, and exists in constant conditions of stress were just becoming apparent. The physical culturists were battling this trend with a belief in overall health and physical conditioning, advocating moderation and balance in all aspects of life. The beer-drinking, pot-bellied strongmen of Europe were certainly not their ideal. What they needed was a model whose physique embodied the ideas they were trying to disseminate, someone who more closely resembled the idealized statues of ancient Greek athletes than the Bavarian beer hall bulls of Europe. They found such a man, Eugen Sandow, in the person of Eugen Sandow, a turn-of-the-century physical culture superstar. Sandow made his reputation in Europe as a professional strongman, successfully challenging other strongmen and outdoing them at their own stunts. He came to America in the 1890s and was promoted by Florenz Ziegfeld, who billed him as the world's strongest man and put him on tour. But what really set Sandow apart was the aesthetic quality of his physique. Sandow was beautiful, no doubt about it. He was an exhibitionist and enjoyed having people look at his body as well as admire his strongman stunts. He would step into a glass case and pose, wearing nothing but a fig leaf, while the audience stared and the women oohed and awed at the beauty and symmetry of his muscular development. This celebration of the aesthetic qualities of the male physique was something very new. During the Victorian age, men had covered themselves in confining clothing, and very few artists used the male nude as a subject for their paintings. This is what made Sandow's appeal so amazing. Due largely to Sandow's popularity, sales of barbells and dumbbells skyrocketed. Sandow earned thousands of dollars a week and created a whole industry around himself through the sale of books and magazines. Contests were held in which the physical measurements of the competitors were compared, then Sandow awarded a gold-plated statue of himself to the winners. But, ultimately, he fell victim to his own macho mystique. It is said that one day his car ran off the road and he felt compelled to demonstrate his strength by single-handedly hauling it out of a ditch. As a result, the man whom King George of England had appointed Professor of Scientific Physical Culture to His Majesty suffered a brain hemorrhage that ended his life. Around the same time, George Hackenschmidt earned the title, the George Hackenschmidt Russian Lion, for his performance when he won the Russian weightlifting championship in 1898 as well as various world wrestling championships. After immigrating to Great Britain, he eventually made a fortune. He was also a fluent orator and a prolific writer who turned out philosophical books such as The Origins of Life, debated intellectuals like George Bernard Shaw, and even challenged Albert Einstein to an exchange of ideas. And there were many more: Professor Louis Attila, Arthur Saxon, Hermann Görner, Oskar Hilgenfeldt, and W. A. Pullum. They created an illustrious tradition of men of strength that continues right up through Paul Anderson and Vasily Alexeyev and other weightlifters of our day. One of those for whom the pursuit of physical culture became practically a religion was the publisher-businessman Bernard McFadden, a man who could serve as the prototype health nut of all time. To promote the idea that physical weakness was actually immoral, he founded the magazine Physical Culture. Later he went on to publish the New York Evening Graphic, a newspaper aimed at an uneducated, unsophisticated audience. McFadden was a master promoter and, starting in 1903, he presented a series of contests at Madison Square Garden in New York to select the most perfectly developed man in the world. At that first contest, he offered a prize of $1,000, a small fortune in those days along with the title. Both the contests and the magazine were successful for decades. And McFadden practiced what he preached, walking barefoot every morning from his home on Riverside Drive in New York City to his office in Midtown and appearing bare-chested in his own magazine. He was an exam, PLE of health and fitness until well into his 70s. McFadden probably would not have approved of modern bodybuilding, with its emphasis on the visual development of the body rather than athletic skill. However, he and other physical culturists played a big part in the evolution of bodybuilding. His contests helped to promote interest in how the body looked rather than simply how strong the muscles were, and there emerged from these contests a superstar who was to become one of the most famous men in America for decades to come. The winner of McFadden's contest in 1921 was Angelo Siciliano. To capitalize on his growing fame, this magnificently developed man changed his name to Charles Atlas and acquired the rights to a mail-order physical fitness course called Dynamic Tension. For more than 50 years boys have grown up seeing the ads for this course in magazines and comic books, including the one where the scrawny kid gets sand kicked in his face, sends away for a muscle-building course, then goes back to beat up the bully and reclaim his girl. "Hey skinny, your ribs are showing," became the most memorable slogan of one of what author Charles Gaines calls the most successful advertising campaign in history. The transition to bodybuilding. By the 1920s and 1930s, it had become evident that health and the development of the physique were closely connected, and that weight training was the best way to produce the greatest degree of muscular development in the shortest possible time. Despite his advertisements, even Charles Atlas used weights rather than the dynamic tension of isometrics to produce his outstanding body. Training knowledge was limited, but bodybuilders of that day were learning a great deal simply by comparing their physiques with those of the stars of the previous generation. For example, one of the most famous turn-of-the-century strongmen was Louis Cyr, 300 massive pounds, thick, chubby, huge around the mid-lee in every inch, the barrel-shaped strongman. But by the 20s there appeared men like Sigmund Klein, who exhibited a physique with beauty, full muscular shape, balance, and proportion, as well as low body fat and extreme definition. Klein became very influential as a gym owner and writer on training and nutrition. His physique, compared to Cyr's, was as day to night. Klein, along with Sandow and influential physical culturists like McFadden, gradually began to convince people that the look of a man's physique, not just his ability to perform feats of strength, was worthy of attention because the kind of training that produced the aesthetically muscular body also contributed to overall health. But the era in which the male physique would be judged purely on an aesthetic basis was still a few years away. Strength developed by weight training was still somewhat suspect in the 1930s, as if weightlifters were not truly worthy to be called athletes. It was almost considered cheating to build up your body by training in a gym instead of participating in a variety of sports. In his earliest writing, the late John Grimek, an Olympic weightlifter who served as the model for so many aspiring bodybuilders, volunteered the information that his magnificent muscles were created by weightlifting, although you'd think that anyone seeing that physique on a beach would have realized that no amount of hand balancing or water polo could have led to such development. However, the tradition of physique competition continued, and by the late 30s occasional shows brought together boxers, gymnasts, swimmers, weightlifters, and other athletes. These contestants had to perform some sort of athletic feat as well as display their physiques, so it was common for weightlifters of the day to be able to do hand balancing and other gymnastic moves. In 1939 things started to change. The Amateur Athletic Union, AAU, stepped in and created a Mr. America contest of its own in Chicago on July 4. The winner was Roland Essmaker. The participants were still not full-fledged bodybuilders, but came from all sorts of athletic backgrounds and posed in everything from boxer shorts to jock straps. But as more and more emphasis was put on how the physique looked, the weightlifters began to enjoy a distinct advantage. Weightlifting changed the contours of the body more than any other kind of training, so they were able to make a very strong and increasingly favorable impression on the judges. In 1940 the AAU produced the first real modern bodybuilding event. Mr. America that year and the next was John Grymek, who trained primarily by lifting weights in a gym. This served notice to anyone who wanted to compete against him that they would have to follow a similar training program. Grymek also put the lie to the idea that men who trained with weights were muscle-bound and unable to perform well athletically. During exhibitions, he was able to stay on the stage doing lifting and posing that involved an extraordinary degree of strength, flexibility, and coordination. Bodybuilding in the 40s and 50s. The winner of the Mr. America title in 1945 was a man whom many believe to be the first truly modern bodybuilder. Clarence Clancy Ross's physique would not look out of place on any stage today. Wide shoulders, flaring lats, narrow waist, good calves and abs. By this time the distinction between lifting weights purely for strength and training with weights to shape and proportion the body had been clearly made. The bodybuilder's physique, as opposed to other types of muscular development, was now recognized as something unique. However, bodybuilding still remained an obscure sport. No champion was known to the general public until Steve Reeves came along. Reeves was the right man in the right place at the right time. He was handsome, personable, and had a magnificent physique. Veterans of the Muscle Beach era, Muscle Beach, now located in Venice, California, was that area of Santa Monica Beach where bodybuilders congregated in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Recall how crowds used to follow Reeves when he walked along the beach, and how people who knew nothing about him would simply stop and stare, awestruck. After winning Mr. America and Mr. Universe, Reeves made movies and became an international star with his portrayal of the title roles in Hercules, the role that both Reg Park and I were later to undertake for the movies, Morgan the Pirate, and The Thief of Baghdad. As far as the general public was concerned, in the 1950s except for the perennial Charles Atlas there was only one famous bodybuilder, Steve Reeves. Up to this point, it's likely that no human being in the history of the planet had ever achieved the level of development of men like Grimneck, Ross, and Reeves. Because they were training harder and more methodically than anyone else ever had, bodybuilders began to learn things about the physical potential of the body that even medical scientists could not have predicted. The word spread and soon there were more and more great bodybuilders coming along every year. Bill Pearl, Chuck Sipes, Jack Dillinger, George Eiferman, and one of my great idols, Reg Park. I remember how incredible it seemed when I met Reg Park in 1967. I was almost speechless with awe. One reason I have always admired him is that he is a big man, very strong, with a powerful-looking physique. When I was just getting started I knew I wanted to build the kind of mass and density that I had seen in his photos, big, rough, and Herculean. Reg was the next major champion to emerge when Reeves left competition for his movie career. He became Mr. Universe in 1951 and became professional Mr. Universe in 1958 and in 1965. At this point, everyone recognized that Reg was far above all other leading bodybuilders. He dominated the bodybuilding scene for 2 decades. Bodybuilding in the 60s. I first came on the international bodybuilding scene in 1966. At that time most of the top bodybuilders I read about in magazines lived and trained in California. Beating Dennis Tinerino in 1967, Mr. America of that year in the National Amateur Bodybuilders Association, NABA, Mr. Universe contest was my first big international victory, but that meant I would now have to go against the other champions of the day. There was certainly some fierce competition around Frank Zane, a man who prepares as thoroughly for a contest as anyone else in bodybuilding, my good friend Franco Columbu, who went from being a great powerlifter to a Mr. Olympia practically by sheer determination of will, and, of course, Sergio Oliva. Anytime people discuss who might be the best bodybuilder of all time, the name Sergio Oliva inevitably comes up. He and I had some unbelievable confrontations on stage. The only way I could beat him was to be in absolutely perfect shape, massive, dense, and cut, and then not make any mistakes. Sergio was so good he could beat you in the dressing room if you weren't careful. His shirt would come off, and there would be that incredible mass. He would transfix you with a look, exhale with a kind of animal grunt, and suddenly the lats would begin to flare, and just when you thought they were the most unbelievable lats you ever saw, boom, out they would come, more and more, until you began to doubt that this was a human being you were looking at. While I was battling for titles in Europe, I was very much aware of the competitions in the United States. Larry Scott had won the first 2 Mr. Olympia contests, and I knew I would eventually have to beat Larry and other top stars like Chuck Sipes. But one bodybuilder I was also impressed with, not just because of his outstanding physique but also because of the image he was able to create, was Dave Draper. Draper represented the epitome of California bodybuilders: big, blonde, and suntanned, with a personable manner and winning smile. Surrounded as I was by 3 feet of snow in the middle of an Austrian winter, the image of Dave Draper on a California beach was a very attractive one indeed. And Dave's roles in movies like Don't Make Waves with Tony Curtis and his appearances on television shows made me aware of the possibilities of bodybuilding beyond the competition arena. In the 1960s there were 2 distinct worlds in bodybuilding, Europe and America. My universe titles in 67 and 68 established me as the pre-eminent bodybuilder in Europe. Ricky Wayne wrote in an article, "If Hercules were to be born today his name would be Arnold Schwarzenegger," but the question still remained as to how well I would do against the American champions. I looked across the ocean and saw Dave Draper, Sergio Oliva, Chet Yorton, Frank Zane, Bill Pearl, Freddie Ortiz, Harold Poole, Ricky Wayne, and others. My challenge was to compete against these great bodybuilders and defeat them. My awareness of the world had expanded tremendously in just a few years. While training in Austria, I had considered winning the Mr. Universe contest in London to be the highest achievement I could aspire to. Now I found that taking that title was only the beginning. I still had a long Larry Scott journey ahead of me and many bodybuilders to defeat before I could.